Okay, calm down.
Just wanted to read some super chats, and one has a very good question. So Tanet writes, would love to hear solutions for citizens in addition to BDS. Tired of feeling so helpless. Voting third party isn't a solution and will have zero impact. Thankful for your platform.
I think that these can be incredibly frustrating times for all of us who, are seized with, as Martin Luther King said, the fierce urgency of now, but just feel that nothing is changing. In fact, that reminds me of a message I got from a former colleague of mine who is still in the U.S. government and has been trying to push things in the right direction, and wrote me a note that said, public statements go nowhere, legal arguments go nowhere, raising awareness goes nowhere, talking to our bosses goes nowhere. So I certainly understand the sense of frustration that people are feeling, both outside and, let me assure you, inside government as well. I think it's important to say, first of all, that this is going to be a marathon, not a sprint. I said earlier on that I think US policy will change. It's not going to happen quickly. And it certainly isn't happening in time for the people of Gaza. I think that we need to first of all remember that this is a huge government, and this is a very deeply political problem, right? That this looks like this is a US policy problem, but actually it's a US political problem. And until we fix the politics around this, we're not going to be able to make much progress on the policy. And that's true, even if you had a president who was 100% on board and willing to address these issues, there's only so much they would be able to do within the current political and frankly political economic constraints. So I think we do need to keep speaking up and reaching out to representatives. I also think we need, frankly, to be reaching out to media, because I think media plays a really important role here in the framing of things, and or the, as you just pointed out, not covering certain things. And just an aside on that, I was talking to a friend of mine who is an editor in a national media organization, and who said to me, when we say something critical of Israel, we get 100 phone calls overnight from around the public of people calling up, and each of those has to go to our ombudsman, who has to address each in its own merits. And that really makes us think about how we word things. But if we say something that is biased towards the Palestinians, no one picks up the phone and calls us. So I think we also need to do a better job of, being constant and, hitting every single nail, every single mole, right? Every time it pops up. At the same time, I think we have to engage politically. We have to take, the energy and momentum that exists right now, and, the shift that we are seeing in American public perceptions, that is, certainly most marked generationally, but frankly, if you look at the polling, transcends both generations and partisan politics, and turn that into political energy. And so I think that is where we need to focus. I will say, and I don't want to get too far ahead of anything, but I'm working with some folks to hopefully launch some new projects in that space in the coming weeks. So stay tuned. But in the meantime, I think the answer is we need to keep America's attention on this, right? Because we know that American attention can be short-lived and can jump around very quickly. So we need to keep the focus on Gaza, and we need to keep making sure that as we particularly go through this election cycle, that our politicians understand that this is an important issue to us, and that this is something that we are going to take into consideration.
You mentioned a political economic system in which our politics operates. So can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, for example, I've been talking to folks not only within the executive branch, but in the legislative branch as well in Congress. And I've heard from a number of different congressional offices, from staff in offices who say that we've been getting calls, on a 10-to-1 ratio in favor of a permanent and lasting ceasefire. But, our chief of staff won't tell our member of Congress that that's what his constituents are telling them, because they don't want to create a situation where, they're going to have to create a tension with a donor. I've also heard directly, as far back as last December, from elected officials, from, someone in the House of Representatives, from a senator, that, yes, behind closed doors, yes, what Israel is doing with our weapons is war crimes, but I'm never going to say that publicly. because it would just be a disaster with my donors, with my donations, and with my a lot of my sort of closest supporters. And so when I talk about the political economy, I mean that we have to find a way to shift that incentive structure. It's my sense that there are actually a lot of members of Congress who do get this, who may not have come out for a ceasefire, who may not have voted, for a ceasefire, or may have voted for expediting arms to Israel, or whatever it might be, but who privately, understand the facts and understand where justice lies. And so I think a lot of what we have to do is not necessarily convincing people, although we have to do that too, but rather shifting the Overton window and shifting the incentive structure whereby people can actually do what they know to be right. Obviously, that's also a very sad commentary on the quality of leadership that we have in Congress in many cases, with some rare but important exceptions. But that's what I mean, that what we need to look at is not just the politics, but the political economy that is driving those politics as well.
Right. I mean, look at what happened to Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush.
Mm-hmm.
Ruined by AIPAC, which sends such a chilling message to other politicians. Why would anyone speak out on this?
To be fair, I think we shouldn't overstate AIPAC's role here. I think both candidates who have been wonderful on this issue, and really outspoken, really supportive of Palestinian humanity and frankly of what is in America's interests, both also faced challenges that were very unrelated to this issue within their own specific contexts. Both were at risk, and I think AIPAC loves to jump in with a lot of money and then take credit for something happening. And I'm not sure that it actually deserves the full amount of credit here. I think that both candidates were in jeopardy without AIPAC's money, and we shouldn't let ourselves be daunted or deterred by that money. And not least in part, right, because there are a number of things on our side that are not on theirs, which are the facts, justice, and increasingly American public understanding.
Sadly, though, facts and justice don't buy votes.
They don't buy votes, but they do weigh into people's votes. And at the end of the day, no one is actually buying votes, right? They're buying media time, they're shaping opinions. But when you walk into that ballot box, or that when you check that ballot box or that ballot, it is ultimately each individual's ability to choose what they want to vote for. And as we have seen in elections, most recently in France, for example, people I think are capable of weighing the rights and wrongs, and so that there is an important aspect of that. So yes, absolutely, there is a very troubling role of not just money, but also really well organized organizations and engagement in American politics. And of course, that isn't limited to this issue. It's the same with big oil, big tobacco, you name it. But I don't think that. I think I'd like to think, right, that there is more to the American voter than money can buy.
And speaking of the American voter and elections, what predictions do you have about the presidential election? Would a President Kamala Harris be different from Joe Biden? Would a President Donald Trump be different from Joe Biden? Or would President Donald Trump be different from Kamala Harris?
So, I'm not going to sort of predict winners or losers. I do think that we are in a very different space now than we were a few weeks ago when, it was Trump against Biden. I think Biden dropping out has changed the dynamics significantly, and probably significantly in the Democrats' favor by all indications. And I do think that should require a rethinking of tactics on our side, because, whereas prior to that terrible debate, I think Gaza was a make or break issue for President Biden and could very well have cost him the presidency. I'm not sure that's still the case with Harris. And therefore, we need to rethink where our leverage is and how we use it. When it comes down to the policy differences, I don't want to be predictive. I think, as I said before, that no American president is going to be able to turn on a dime when it comes to Israel-Palestine, even if they wanted to. And so I think we should be very cautious and limited in our expectations. I think US military and financial support for Israel is not going to change within the next presidency. So I think, in terms of what we expect and what we ask for, we need to be circumspect. We should certainly, push maximalist requests and demands, because this is what justice demands. It's also what the American interest demands. But, in terms of how much anyone would deviate from where we are now, I think that will be limited. But where I think there would be a significant difference is on the domestic front. I think if we want to change American policy towards Israel-Palestine, that is something that starts at home. It starts at the ballot box. It starts in the bureaucracy. It starts on college campuses. It starts in the streets. It starts with people raising their voices. And I do think that a President Trump would be much more difficult to have that sort of public debate under than a President Harris has been. Not only, obviously have I and a dozen others resigned, but I've also stood outside the White House with current US government staff as they held up banners that said, President Biden, your staff demands a ceasefire. Under President Trump, I'm not sure they could get away with that. When we see the student protests, yes, they have been dealt with absolutely abysmally. The Department of Education has been completely absent in its responsibility to stand up for students and to stand up for all its responsibilities under Title IX. And college administrators have been hand in glove with both the police and with a lot of their trustees who've been pushing to crack down. But I think it would be a lot more violent and a lot worse and a lot more arrests, as we know from the Black Lives Matter protests under President Trump. So that's where I think the difference is. Not so much, hopefully, in the foreign policy, I don't know, but certainly in our ability to have the debate at home that enables or drives change in foreign policy.